Hey, it's Tom here and welcome back to the channel. So one of the most popular questions that I get oftentimes in my Q&A videos is to do with how I got started investing, how I started learning about investing, and how I sort of developed a strategy over time. And I by no means claim to know everything about investing. Learning is sort of a lifelong process, and I hope to put a lot more stuff in the knowledge bank than I currently have up there. So still a long way to go, of course, but I have learned quite a bit over the last 4 years or so that I have been investing in the stock market. So in this video, I basically want to go through kind of start to finish a lot of the key resources that I have picked up along the way, and a lot of the things that have helped me to shape my own investment philosophy. I don't think I'm going to be able to get through every single book and every podcast and video and everything that I've ever watched or read or listened to, of course, but I'm going to try and give you the highlights, and I really hope that if you haven't come across some of these, they are quite useful in helping you to develop your own investment philosophy and strategy as well. So I'll try and leave as much as I can linked down in the description below. The books, of course, will be easy to find. Just Google those. But if I'm talking about videos or podcasts, I'll try to link those where possible in the description if you want to check those out. But without further ado, let's get straight into it, and I hope you enjoy. Now, I bought my first years in the stock market back in around 2017, and it was really basic investing. There was no strategy at all. I specifically remember watching like an ASB bank video that was done from New Zealand and put on their YouTube channel, talking about just what a share is and that it's a piece of ownership in a company, and that if you buy them, you can basically make money two ways. Either you can get paid a dividend or the price can go up or down depending on how the business is performing. And that was about the extent of my knowledge at the time, but with that key piece of knowledge, I went and invested, and I believe 2 individual companies here in New Zealand, and also one ETF, an NZ Top 50 ETF. That ETF I actually still hold today. But the 2 individual companies, it was literally just looking up the stock chart and seeing if they've gone sort of up and to the right over the last few years and thinking surely if they've done that, they must be a good investment. And I also remember making like the classic rookie mistake of looking at 2 pretty similar businesses, both in logistics here in New Zealand, and seeing that one was trading at a cheaper dollar per share price than the other one. So I thought it must have been a bargain, and I bought the one with a cheaper dollar price just on the individual shares, which now looking back at that is just a funny thing to kind of think about. But I basically got to the point after making those first couple of investments of really needing to recognize that I need a real strategy if I want to put real amounts of money to work. So luckily this wasn't any huge piece of money that if it all went to zero I couldn't recover from or anything like that. I just started in my professional career out of university, but I did want to try and learn a few more things so that over time, if I was to put serious money into the stock market, which I certainly am now, I need to have a good strategy in order to be able to do that comfortably and be confident about the returns I can generate over a long period of time. And it was really from that wanting to improve my investing knowledge that I started to come across some of the resources that I want to share in this video. So what started me with going down this rabbit hole was kind of just stumbling across 2 individuals. Now, Warren Buffett is the first one and Phil Town is the second one. So Warren Buffett is pretty easy to just stumble across. He's kind of everywhere in the investing world, and he's sort of widely regarded obviously as the greatest investor of all time, so he wasn't a particularly hard one to stumble across. Phil Town was one that I kind of just randomly found actually on a podcast app one day. So I was literally searching investing in my Apple Podcasts app, and then the Invested podcast by Phil Town and Danielle Town came up. I started giving it a listen, and to date I've listened to every single episode of that particular podcast, including the one that came out just yesterday as I'm recording this video. So been a pretty avid listener of that podcast, and that was really the first thing that kind of helped to shape my investment philosophy. So Phil Town, for those that don't know, basically is a value investor. He describes himself as what he calls a Rule 1 investor, which is sort of an ode to Warren Buffett's quote, rule number 1, don't lose money, and rule number 2, don't forget rule number 1. So all about protection from downside, and if you can take care of the downside, the upside generally takes care of itself. But that's basically value investing, just with a maybe slightly cooler name. And Phil Town has been really influential, particularly in the early days, for me to build a strategy around investment. So he was really the first person that I came across that turned the Warren Buffett strategy into practical steps. So in terms of giving us this 4M analysis template, meaning, moat, management, margin of safety, just a basic checklist on how to work through a company. And at the time, he was the first one that laid out some pretty basic ways to value a company as well. So I'd heard Warren Buffett, for example, talk about buying businesses below their intrinsic value, but I'd never seen anyone actually calculate an intrinsic value. It was always sort of this thing they talked about, but there were really no hard numbers behind it. And Phil Town was one of the first people that I saw actually go through a calculation to try and figure that out. So if you're looking to follow that Phil Town sort of methodology as well, there's a couple resources from Phil that I would recommend. Firstly is podcasts, so they come out with sort of half-hour long episodes roughly every single week, which is really, really good. I'd recommend going right back to the start and basically listening to as many as you can, because they do start right at the beginning. Phil Town's basically teaching his daughter, Danielle Town, how to invest, and she starts out very, very fresh. So those are really nice to listen to, because Danielle asks all the what I now view as pretty obvious questions, but I didn't view them as that obvious back then, and kind of forces Phil Town to make sure he explains everything really, really well. So would definitely recommend the podcast. Phil Town also has 3 books, so Rule 1, Payback Time, and Invested, which is a book that he did write with Danielle. I've got all 3 of them sitting here behind me. If you do want to just kind of skip to one, I would probably read Invested. That basically recaps everything in Rule 1 and Payback Time, and then adds a little bit on top from Danielle's perspective as well. So that would be the first major resource that I really used and I would recommend. Now, while I'm on the topic of books, I will add a few others to that sort of recommended reading list. So after reading Rule 1, actually before I read Rule 1, I read The Intelligent Investor by Ben Graham. Everyone recommends it. Warren Buffett describes it as the best book on investing ever written. I would not read that first. I did read it first, and it was a bad decision in hindsight. I did not understand half of the stuff in there. But I think after you've read some of the Phil Town books, then moving to maybe something like The Intelligent Investor can be particularly useful. Certainly read Chapter 8 and Chapter 20 at the very least. So those are the chapters on Mr. Market and, of course, Margin of Safety if you haven't read that book before. And a few final books I'll recommend before I move on to some of these other video resources and things. The ones that have been most influential on my investing strategy would be The Dando Investor by Mohnish Pabrai. So that covers sort of a deep value approach to investing, trying to buy a dollar for 50 cents. Granted, Mohnish Pabrai has transitioned a little bit away from that strategy now, but I think it's still very, very useful. I still employ that strategy quite a bit, so I really like The Dando Investor. I would also recommend The Education of a Value Investor by Guy Spear. That's not so much a book about how to invest, but a book about how to approach investing from a kind of mindset perspective, which I found really useful as well. One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch is a classic, really good intro for people who are looking to, again, understand businesses in their everyday lives, really, and make money from them, hopefully in the stock market. And also 100 Baggers by Chris Mayer. So the title of the book might sound a bit clickbaity, trying to find stocks that go up 100x, but it is literally a case study of about 365 of those companies, I think it is. And there are some really, really good lessons in there that we can apply to all sorts of different investments. So on the reading front, I've read a lot of investing books over the last few years, but those are the ones that continue to be sort of at the top of the list for me. Now, if reading piles of books aren't quite your thing, hopefully these next couple of resources can help you out. And these are both from Berkshire Hathaway, or Warren Buffett / Berkshire Hathaway. So the first one is actually the Berkshire Hathaway annual meetings. So from 1994 through to 2021, there are video versions of the full Berkshire Hathaway annual meetings on YouTube. You can search those up on YouTube, watch them. They're several hours long each, but I find them really useful just to listen to while I'm working on something, because they're basically just multi-hour long Q&A sessions with Warren and Charlie. And what I found is that as you kind of work through the years, of course, each individual year there's something kind of topical going on. So, you hear them talk through the tech bubble, through the 99-2000 period. You hear them talk in the lead up to the global financial crisis, where they actually mentioned that they thought housing was pretty hot in many parts of the world, or in many parts of the country, I should say. You hear them talk through 2008, 2009, and then you hear them talk right through to where we are today. So there's sort of those key themes at different points in time. but really a lot of the core messages about how to go about investing are unchanged. And I found myself, after having listened to the first few annual meetings, hearing a question in a later annual meeting, and then sort of already knowing what I thought Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger were going to say, and maybe 8 or 9 times out of 10 being pretty close to accurate in terms of what their actual response was versus what I thought they might say. So if you ever get to that stage, hopefully that means that you're starting to understand Buffett and Munger's perspective on investing quite well. So would definitely recommend checking out those meetings. In conjunction with the annual meetings, I'd also recommend checking out the Buffett letters if you haven't done that before. So there's basically 2 sets of Warren Buffett letters. So there are the Buffett partnership letters from the 1950s, so pre-Berkshire Hathaway. Warren Buffett ran his own investment partnership, actually a series of partnerships. And he has very good letters from throughout that time period where he was doing, I think, close to 30% a year within those funds. So those are great to actually understand how Warren Buffett was managing smaller amounts of money. Of course, he's investing hundreds of billions today. He was investing in the single millions at some points, through that partnership, and even under $1 million, I think, in his first initial partnership. So to hear him talk about investing smaller amounts of money and getting into more obscure companies, and even buying what he called some workouts, which were like private businesses, which he would liquidate and this sort of stuff. It's really interesting to kind of see that journey. It's kind of funny reading some of those things now where he's talking about, he's gotten to a certain size in the fund where he's really excited because he can go out and buy businesses that he wasn't able to before because he didn't have enough capital. Now he kind of has the opposite problem. He's got too much money to deploy, and really his universe of investable businesses is now quite small, but pretty interesting to kind of see him go through that transition. So those are the Buffett partnership letters from the 50s. Again, I'll try and link that down in the description below. And then you've got the Berkshire Hathaway letters from the 1970s onwards, I think it is. If you just go to the Berkshire Hathaway website, you'll see all of those letters. But there are about 6 or 7 years in the early 1970s, I think it is, which are really difficult to find, and I did manage to actually track them down, so I will leave that down in the description below if you want to find those letters too. But those Buffett letters are just a mountain of wisdom. I'm actually still working through all of them myself, but every single year that I work through those, I learn a lot from Warren Buffett. Now, if you've read some of the books that I've mentioned and you've watched a lot of the Berkshire annual meetings and you've read maybe some of the letters as well, I think you're probably getting to a point to where I started to make some mistakes. Now, the mistakes that I made really were not necessarily all that bad a decision, but I really did continue to spend a lot of time on trying to learn about investing. So reading about investing I found really interesting. I still find it really interesting. And there's always little things I can pick up from books and investor letters and YouTube videos and so on. But I probably didn't dedicate enough time to reading for investing. So this is something I think I've heard Guy Spear say as well. You can spend all the time in the world reading about investing, but if you don't eventually read for investing and start getting into individual company annual reports and doing due diligence on individual businesses, you're obviously not going to turn over many rocks and be able to find many great investment opportunities. So that is where I would go to next. I would start looking at individual businesses that have pretty simple business models that you really understand. And I would do this not from a perspective of wanting to necessarily invest in those companies. That may well happen. But I would do it from the perspective of just trying to understand how a company explains its business to investors. So if you look up a 10K or an annual report over in the US, I personally picked a couple of really simple businesses that I understand pretty well. So the likes of Facebook was one of the first annual reports I ever read, Monster Beverage, Costco, Chipotle, and of course Berkshire Hathaway is a much more complex business, but Warren Buffett really dumbs that company down and helps you to understand it, which you're obviously getting through the Berkshire letters as well. So that would be the next place I would go to, is just try to get your head around a handful of businesses that you already know and maybe interact with in your everyday life. So read through the annual reports, read through some of the quarterly reports. A lot of these businesses also will have investor conference calls, so that's a really good way to hear analysts, for example, ask different questions to these companies that you maybe haven't thought about, and some of the key drivers that really push that business forward or maybe hold it back, and they will question management on what's going on in those sort of different aspects of the business. So certainly spend a lot of time reading about investing, but spend plenty of time reading for investing as well. And really the final couple of things that I've done to continue trying to learn, it's kind of twofold. The first one I would say is actually following what a lot of my favorite investors are doing. So for example, we have the quarterly 13F series on the channel where I look at what well-known investors have bought in the last quarter or what they've sold in the last quarter, and that's been a really good resource for me to get ideas kind of come in the top of the funnel and have a long list of businesses to look into and potentially clone some investments as well. So the business that I'm spending probably the most time on, or not probably, definitely the most time on at the moment, is Alibaba, having seen a handful of really good investors buy that recently. So Charlie Munger, Monish Pabrai, Greg Alexander, I think even Bill Miller potentially. He might have actually sold it. I'll put up a screenshot here. But there's a lot of big names in that particular investment, and it's one that I've tried to add to my list of businesses that I know and understand very well. So for example, I've just finished reading Alibaba, the house that Jack Ma built. I found a few new people to follow both here on YouTube and also on Twitter that know e-commerce in China very well, also know cloud services in China very well, and know the kind of competitive landscape between things like Alipay and WeChat Pay and so on. So that's been really useful to try and figure out as well. And then, of course, the entire way through, I'm continuing to do general reading. I recently read a 30-page or so case study on Norbert Liu, who is at Punchcard Capital, has a very, very concentrated portfolio and a great performance track record. There's a case study from him floating around from a few years ago that's kind of resurfaced that I've read recently. I've got a long list of podcasts that I listen to pretty religiously, and I've done videos on that. So it's kind of just this constant evolution of trying to get as much information about investments into my head as I possibly can. Frankly, I've been pretty obsessed with this stuff over the past few years, so it hasn't been too difficult to keep actively researching and trying to learn as much as I can. But it's been an ongoing process, and one that I'm sure will continue on for a long time to come. So those are a few of my favorite investing resources and kind of my pathway in terms of trying to get to where I am now with my level of understanding of how to go about investing, largely focused on the stock market. And of course, like I say, I don't claim to know everything, but I feel like I have made some good progress over the last few years. So I do hope you find some of those resources useful, particularly if you haven't come across some of them before. If you think there's anything major that I've missed, definitely let me know down in the comments below. I'm always looking for new investing material to absorb and shove into my brain. So definitely drop a comment down below if you've got anything in mind that you think I should check out. But that's it from me for this one. If you did enjoy the video, please hit like and hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers.